In today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast, we're joined by Brendan Clean of Locked On Suns to talk with us about Monty Williams and how he can impact the Detroit Pistons this season and moving forward. Stay tuned for all of that in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, what's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I am your host, Kuka Hill. You can find me over on Twitter at Kuka Hill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jase case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat up to 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That's Jase medical.com. So, on today's episode, we're going to be joined by Brendan. He is the host of Locked On Suns. You can follow him on Twitter at BrendanClean14. Brendan, thank you for hopping on the podcast real quick with me. Should be a fun episode and talking about a guy that you have grown to be obviously pretty familiar with over the last few years, and Monty Williams, who the Pistons paid this offseason. At the time of the hiring, he was the highest paid coach ever. I believe there's 2 since then that have supplanted it now, but at the time he was the highest paid coach in NBA history. Obviously the Pistons went for a big splash there, and they really want to see some improvement this season, but also they think he's the guy long-term as well. So where I want to start this with is when Monty took over Phoenix, obviously the Phoenix Suns weren't very good. But then they had that quick run in the bubble. Just talk with us about and give us an idea of how much do you believe Monty impacted Phoenix's ability to go from, around the bottom of the league to what they became?
Instrumental. I mean, I think there's no other argument to make, right? But it was 2 things at once that happened. And the Suns could not have been more broken and bottom of the bottom when he came, right? Like they had tried. I think Devin Booker had at least 1 coach every season of his NBA career. I think he only had 1 season where there wasn't a head coaching change outside of his rookie year up until Monty came. Igor Kokoshkov did not work out here, if anyone even remembers that name. And then obviously we know now Robert Sarver was not making life easy on anybody in that building. So they needed stability, they needed a culture, and that was what he prioritized when he got into the building. Was just, he went to dinner with Devin Booker. He told him that everything the franchise was going to be was about him, right? Like, I believe in you. You're why I took this job. And he went about creating that, improving and creating and stabilizing that relationship between coach and star player from the very beginning. And at the same time, they went a long way toward getting vets in the building, right? So I think that's where it can be a little bit hard to separate. Obviously, if you ask me, could Monty have instituted the offensive and defensive improvements that the Suns saw under him in that first year with the talent that Kokoshkov had the previous season? I'm going to tell you no, right? Like, they got Aaron Baines. They got, they got Aaron Baines, I believe, that season. They got Cam Johnson that season. They got Ricky Rubio that summer in free agency. And Dario Saric. So that's 4 vets who, Cam Johnson kind of playing like a vet, stabilizing, floor-raising players. So it was a little bit of both, but Monty made them better the minute he got in the door by developing that culture and having a real scheme on both ends that they could buy into for sure.
So I think that it's a funny parallel because right when the Pistons hired Monty, obviously they didn't do much in free agency, but they did go out and get Joe Harris. They went out and got Monty Morris, and they also kept Bojan Bogdanovic instead of, at least at this point on the 13th of September, he is still on the Pistons, and it looks like he's going to be on the team this season. So they did keep and acquire some veterans to try to shore up their rotation. What I want to ask about Monty is this. The Pistons obviously are a very young team. And at the time when he took over Phoenix Suns, obviously the core of their team was pretty young as well. Devin Booker was still pretty young. Just talk about how much he impacted? You talked about the culture. Could you go even further into that, maybe a little deeper into how he changed what the culture was, what was the culture before, and how he was able to stabilize it, and what really, sparked that with him?
Yeah, I mean, I think it did start with the star player, but I also think that there was a level of, I don't know how much this applies to the Pistons, but I'll just say it. I mean, I think that some of what I was talking about with Sarver and the chaos and the turnover and everything, I think Monty went about, when he got here, he became the face of everything, right? So it's like, if there's player mistakes happening, if there's questions about anything going on the court, if there's questions about off the court, they had not scandals, they had like controversy still with guys like Josh Jackson and different draft picks that were kind of lingering in the background, and they had to cut guys and do a bunch of different things as they turned everything over. And it was always like, he's going to answer every question. He's going to be there to kind of be the face of everything and speak to it. So I think from an external, like public facing point of view, he became that for this team in a way that honestly ended up getting kind of weird at times once they got better, because it was just like, he didn't feel comfortable in that anymore and whatever, but that's, that came later. And then I would just say kind of behind the scenes, like, I think just having the ability to say, like, we have these vets and we're going to be able to win, I think that goes a long way toward being able to institute that, because again, it's like, you can say you have to play defense to get minutes, you can say you have to execute, you can say you have to behave behind closed doors and be a good teammate and all those things, but when you're losing, a lot of that just falls away. So it is kind of hard to separate and go through that alternative world where, like, what would the culture like have been like if they had another lottery season? They were technically a lottery team when he got here, but they were, the talk of the league after the bubble. What happens if they're not as good? Like, I don't really know, but what ended up happening is they won a lot of games and turned things around, and they were able to hold guys accountable in a way, because it's like, well, you got to fit into the winning team, because now we're a winning team,
One of the main things I've heard about Monty since he showed up in Detroit, one of the main things I've read about him, one of the main things that really jumped off the screen when you watch his press conference, to me, it seems like he's just like a natural leader of men, especially, helping to get a team like the Pistons, who have a bunch of young men. I saw a video just today from Miles Turner, and he was talking about how he didn't get drafted to Orlando Magic, and how he was happy that he didn't go to Miami, because a lot of fans and a lot of people don't understand that these guys are kids when they're coming into the league. And not only are they having to improve as players, they're trying to grow up. They're immature. They're trying to become, grown men. And that's one of the things that Dwayne Casey was very good at for the Pistons. Yeah. And it felt like the vibe that I got from Monty and the things I've read about Monty is he's kind of from that same, leadership perspective of trying to he's not just trying to lead you on the court. He's also a part of these guys' lives and trying to help them grow as humans and have them grow as these young guys that the Pistons have, try to help them grow as young men. Is that something that was apparent in Phoenix as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the biggest ingredient, and you're right to bring us there, because I mean, for anybody who's familiar with Christianity and kind of that walk of life, like, servant leadership is a big thing, and anybody who's a Pistons fan, like, you're going to be hearing about this stuff. It's a big part of what he is and what makes him who he is. Like, everybody knows the story, or maybe some people don't, about the losses that he's experienced in his life with his wife and everything else. And the sermon that he gave went viral. Like, it's not every day a coach in sports giving a sermon is like national news, but he was that impactful with the things that he said and kind of how he overcame that. So, he's always been religious, but I think he kind of really doubled down. And obviously the other thing about coming to Phoenix was it was his first job after that. It was the first time he made himself available for interviews, the first time he pursued being a head coach again. He went to the front office in San Antonio. He was an assistant in Oklahoma, or in Philadelphia, and then came to Phoenix. And I think part of making that jump and kind of coming back out of his private life post the passing of his wife was to say, like, I have the skills that I have as a leader, and I owe it to myself to try to explore that. And so, yeah, he definitely went about doing that. There's viral speeches from any number of games throughout his time here where he's talking to DeAndre Ayton, or he's telling Booker in the locker room in the bubble, like, this happened because of you, or he's, in the media talking about any number of moments in his life or connections that he has with guys like Greg Popovich or James Borrego or different people. So that's hard to miss. That's hard to not have an impact on people. And especially for a young team, I think that level of seriousness and positivity and kind of just mentality and approach to what he always says, like, basketball is a get to, not a got to, right? Like, nobody's owed a career, nobody's owed minutes, nobody's owed anything. And if people don't have that approach, I think that they hear about it. They might not get benched. He's not going to make a fool of them, but that is like a get with it, or, you're probably not going to be long for the team type of mentality for sure. And I think he'll bring that to Detroit.
Right. I actually, before we move on, I just want to say one of my favorite moments with Monty. Now, obviously, I'm an outside observer. I don't watch the Phoenix Suns all the time, but one of my favorite moments as an outsider watching the Suns was when they made the finals and Chris Paul goes up to Monty and hugs him, and they have like this emotional moment on the court because they were together in New Orleans. Was it New Orleans? Yeah, New Orleans. Early in their career, and how much it just meant, and how close they obviously were. How close and comfortable CP3 felt with Monty to have that kind of moment with him. I thought that was pretty cool. It was pretty cool seeing that.
He has those relationships with everybody, and they're genuine. When he went to when they won the conference finals in 2021, and they're about to go to the finals, obviously his first time there as a head coach and everything, he brought Fred Vincent, or not Fred Vincent. What am I saying? I'm spacing on the dude's name. Randy Ayers, the coach that he's been mentored by for a long time, had as an assistant in a bunch of spots, and he brought that guy up to do his press conference with him. It's like, it's not an act. It is legit, and you'll definitely see that, I'm sure, because he brought like his whole coaching staff too. So those relationships are going to stick around.
Yeah, he did get to bring a lot of his own guys to Detroit, so it's going to be interesting to see that. The next thing we're going to talk about is Monty's offensive and defensive philosophies. I can't wait to talk about that. It's going to be incredibly interesting. Stay tuned for that. But first, I've got to tell you guys about one of our sponsors, Jase Medical. Everyone should feel confident to take care of themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. Jase handles everything from online evaluation to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation and care. With Jase Medical's Jase case, you get 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. All you have to do is fill out a simple online form, and in some cases, jump on a quick call with one of their onboard certified physicians. It's doctor created and doctor recommended. Here's a review from a Jase customer named Frank. Quote, I received our package the same day I got a sinus infection, and my doctor was out of town. No appointment for days. Thank goodness it arrived. In 2023, with pandemics, shortages, storms, you should be prepared for just about everything. Jase Medical is simple. You go online, fill out a form, and then you get the prescription, life-saving medications right at your door. The Jase case gives you that peace of mind in case of any type of emergency. You can save up to over $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jase Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using our code LOCKEDON at checkout on jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. Use code LOCKEDON for additional $20 off with your order. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. And if you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. That's another great way to support the podcast. Before we dive into Monty Williams' offensive and defensive philosophy, I want to let you guys know, again, my listeners, we are returning to full-time next week, 5 episodes. Monday through Friday. We're back to full-time next week, so you guys stay tuned for that. I know you guys are going to be happy about that. Training camp's around the corner. We're going to be diving into player reviews, season previews, some rumors that are going around training camp, Rico Hines footage. Like, that's going to be all we're talking about next week. Stay tuned. We're getting ready for the season. It's right around the corner. Can't wait for that. But, Brendan, all right, let's talk about Monty's offensive and defensive schemes, his philosophies, all that. One of the main things that made me so interested in the possibility of Monty in the offseason when he was when he moved on from the Phoenix Suns was the fact, well, one, the Pistons, other candidates that they were interviewing, I wasn't too high on. But Monty as well, the main comparison I really drew was the fact that outside of obviously this past half a season when they had KD, that team was built around their contending teams were built around CP3 and Devin Booker, 2 guards. I don't feel like you see that very often in the NBA. I just tweeted out actually a few days ago, like, when's the last time you've seen a championship team or win a championship with their 2 best players being guards? The argument maybe for Golden State in 2015, even though I would say Draymond was their second best player, you have to go all the way back to the Detroit Bad Boys in 1990.
Yeah.
With Joe Dumars and Isaiah Thomas. You don't see it often. And that was the team that Monty had, and he was able to take them to the finals. And obviously in Detroit, they got Cade and Jane Ivey, who seemed to be the focal points of their offense. So that was the biggest comparison to me. I thought, okay, he knows how to work with CP3 and D Book. He's coming over to a team with Cade Cunningham, who I think operates in similar spots to D Booker. And honestly, a little bit like CP3 as well. But just two guards who are going to be focal point of the offense. What were some – how can you explain to our listeners just how did he use CP3 and Devin Booker offensively? What was some offensive sets? Was it, just give us an idea of what the offense looked like with CP3 and Devin Booker in Phoenix.
Yeah, I would say the biggest change from the jump was to put Booker off ball in the first place. And that came even before Chris Paul got there, right? But then, Booker was still really high usage that first year with Ricky Rubio. Then Chris Paul gets there. And I think it honestly settled Monty into more of the offense that he wanted to run, and I'm pretty curious. I mean, you would be able to speak to it more than me, how Ivy necessarily fits into it. I've been thinking about it, and you came on, the Just Basketball show, and I had my best lineup with Morris and Cade and not Ivy, just in terms of what I know about Monty from year one, how it's going to fit into place the best, and maybe where Ivy's not quite ready to be the guy to initiate things every single time. But I mean, from what they do, that standpoint, I think it was a lot just about how do you build off of a basic pick and roll, right? How do you have a pre-screen for the big man? How do you have something happening on the weak side that involves the gravity of Devin Booker or a different shooter to pull the help away? How are you running maybe an initial screen or a dump off to the elbow or the high post for a big to start initiating, and then Booker getting into space from there? They did use Chris Paul as the primary initiator, obviously a ton, but whether it was bench units or after Chris Paul made the first move, guys like Dario Saric, guys like DeAndre Ayton, those dudes were initiators too. I mentioned Aaron Baines a while ago. He did that. Frank Kaminsky was on this team not too long ago and led to a lot of success for them. So everybody does get to initiate, but it's basically how do you use screens and off-ball movement to build off of just a simple high pick and roll with your center and your point guard. It's not overly sophisticated in terms of reinventing the wheel, but it is pretty complicated in terms of how much is happening in the half court and guys needing to kind of be in sync and developing chemistry off of that.
So I like hearing that, and I watched there's a few videos on YouTube that I looked up as soon as the Pistons hired Monty. I tried to look up Phoenix Suns offense and just started trying to find things. There were a few YouTube videos that actually broke down the year that Phoenix's offense, I believe, was at the top of the league. There were some videos breaking down how they went about it, what was their offense like, and I watched some of that. So I was happy to see that they did run a lot of pick and rolls, and I think with Cade and Jalen Duren, that being your focal point offensively, that pick and roll, I think that could be really lethal. And we kind of heard how good it was already at Team USA camp with how Cade and Duren apparently played. Obviously, if my listeners, if you haven't already, we had Ben Galver on the podcast weeks ago to talk about what Cade looked like at that Team USA camp, and Duren talked very highly of them. Go listen to that if you haven't already. But I'm really interested to see that with Ivy. It's going to be really fun to see how Ivy plays this year, because at the beginning of the year he was playing off ball with Cade, and he was actually pretty good off ball, and on open catch and shoot threes this past season he was in the 88th percentile. So he actually is a fine shooter off ball, and he moves around pretty well off ball as well, cutting wise. So I'm interested to see how they use them both. The question I want to talk about the offense real quick before we move on to the defense is you kind of mentioned that they initiate a lot of offense, or not, maybe not a lot of it, but some of it through a DeAndre Ayton, some of it through a Dario Saric, a Frank Kaminsky, all that. Jalen Duren, I think, is a tremendous passer for a big man. We saw a lot of it this past season. I thought we should have seen more of it in some DHO actions at the wing, at the high post area. Was that part of DHOs, or trying to get your big man to really utilize his passing? Did Monty utilize that in Phoenix? Did he have the personnel to even do it? Or basically I want to know, did he utilize any kind of passing and playmaking through his big men?
Definitely. I mean, and I'll actually jump on the cutting point you made with Ivy a minute ago first, because the first year before Chris got here, this team cut a ton. They actually were really high, not really high, but they were much higher in rim frequency that season, even though you think of that as being something the Suns have struggled with. The first year it was fine. Guys like Kelly Oubre and Mikal Bridges were getting open shots consistently by cutting, and Rubio's such a good passer that it was really working, and the bigs were finding those guys too. So I would expect with a less of a control freak, and I mean that with all due respect to Chris Paul as the point guard, you'll see more of that being emphasized by Monty too. So that leads us to the big men stuff. And yeah, I guess the short answer would be if he has the talent to do it, I think he'll do it. And I think big picture with Duren, just to make the point since we're on the topic of it, like I think Duren is going to grow as much as he seizes, right? Like I think early on, Monty was totally comfortable with Ayton growing at his own pace. I think that the training wheels started to be put back on for Ayton, and there started to be some friction between those two once Ayton showed Monty that he wasn't growing anymore. He was regressing in some categories, was not focused and making the best decisions at all times on the court. But if Duren can show and prove and consistently perform at certain skills, whether that's passing, which there will be opportunities to do, or other things we can probably talk about on the defensive end, I think Monty will let him do it. But he is a little bit of a, 3 strikes and you're out type of coach, right? So that's a little bit of an aside. But I think to answer the thing about big men, absolutely. I just think the longer things went on, the Suns just we didn't see them use those guys that way because, like 2 years ago it was Ayton and JaVale McGee. Those guys aren't passers, right? But when he had the personnel, he absolutely took advantage of it.
Fair enough. So like you mentioned, let's move on to the defense. This is probably the most interesting area for me because I want to know what the Pistons are going to do defensively, what their schemes are going to be, how aggressive they're going to play defensively. Are they going to play more passive, aggressive? Are they going to play a lot of drop? Are they going to be switching? Because for the first 2 years of the Pistons restore that Troy Weaver calls it, they kept getting and kept talking about was the ability to switch, and getting players who are capable of guarding multiple positions. With Duren, after drafting Duren, who I absolutely love, I think Duren's going to be absolutely fantastic. But this past season, I thought we saw the Pistons use him in a few different ways defensively to try to get an idea of what he would be most comfortable with. You saw sometimes he'd switch. You saw him go up and play pretty high in the pick and roll. You see him hedge. But I feel like most of it, you saw him in drop coverage a lot in his rookie season. And he's an 18-year-old. He wasn't good defensively. Most 18-year-olds are not good defensively. He's going to have to grow in that department. But it was interesting because it felt like to me they weren't 100% sure which way they want to go with Duren yet defensively. What's Monty's philosophy defensively? Is he a big drop guy?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, honestly, the further we get from it, and if I can be somewhat negative, but we're kind of talking about two different phases of the team, right? Like I definitely think what he did defensively to get this team from awful to good was a lot of credit to him for that. I think as they got better and as we get further away from the approach that he took to their defense a couple of years ago when they made the finals and whatever, and as recently as like 3 months ago when they lost in the playoffs, it feels a little bit like kind of what's the expression? It's not pins and needles. That's what you feel when you're about to pass out or whatever. It's like it was just kind of cobbled together. I think that it was a floor-raising defensive approach that lacked the flexibility to really be elite. And some of that's personnel, right? When Jay Crowder is 6'6" and he's playing the 4 for you, it's hard. But even with Durant, again, we talked about with Ayton, and I think the lack of imagination with Ayton that really hurt was more so on the defensive end, right? Like not switching, not hedging, not blitzing, not taking advantage of all the things that make Ayton kind of a unique talent at the center position. I think Monty does deserve a lot of criticism for not exploring that stuff enough and preferring sort of that conservative approach, right? Like they're going to play drop. The point of attack defender is going to go over the screen. They're going to help aggressively at the nail, try to take away the paint that way and live with the results, right? But you put a great big creator like a LeBron or a Giannis or a Luka or whoever against that scheme, and they're just going to draw fouls at will. They're going to get the matchups they want, and they're going to do whatever, But as far as switching goes, they're going to switch a lot 1 through 4, I would imagine. I don't know who the best point of attack defender on this team is, but typically the Suns, obviously it was Mikal Bridges, and they tried their best to not necessarily have to switch him until late in the clock and keep that 1-5 pick and roll defense intact, and then, switch the secondary guys, or late in the clock maybe start to switch a little bit more, but try to just defend the pick and roll with those same 2 guys as often as they could. So yeah, it went a long way with those principles for elevating their floor as a defensive team. Again, that ceiling is, I think, just where you run into some trouble.
All right, when we come back, I want to talk about the defense a little bit more, and then also talk about Monty as a playoff coach when the Pistons eventually get there, as he's obviously going to be their coach, it seems like, for a very long time. We'll talk about that as well, so stay tuned for that. But first, I've got to tell you guys about another one of our sponsors, FanDuel Sportsbook. Lions fans, they won. They beat the Kansas City Chiefs. I hope you guys took the money line over at FanDuel. Again, FanDuel has been pretty high on the Detroit Lions. Like I've been telling you guys, they had them as favorites to make the playoffs. They had them as favorites to win 10-plus games. A lot of people are feeling the Lions, man, 1-0. But outside the Lions, you can get ready for the rest of the NFL season, all the other NFL teams, with the incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use. You can bet on everything from the spreads to player props and more. FanDuel is my favorite place to go. Extremely easy. I can promise you guys it is. You get paid instantly. All of that, absolutely great. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and kick off the NFL season with an offer you won't want to miss. Again, that's FanDuel.com/LockedOn and kick off the NFL season. That's with FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. And if you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. The last question I want to ask you, Brendan, about defensively, before we move on to Monty as a playoff coach, and then we'll wrap up the podcast, is we don't know exactly what the Pistons starting lineup's going to be. We have a pretty good feeling that it's going to be Bojan and Stu on the wings with Cade, Ivy, and Duren around them. But there's a chance that Ausar Thompson takes up and becomes a starting small forward instantly, which is something I think should happen. And we've seen James Edwards III of The Athletic actually write an article recently saying that it may be more likely than we think. But either way, depending on the lineup that they go with, it could be a really defensive lineup. If they were to go with Ausar and Stu, that's not necessarily an offensive lineup, but it seems to be buying completely in on defense. My thing is, if they were to go with a lineup like that, or if they were to play lineups like that all together, I'd like to see this team be pretty aggressive defensively, try to force turnovers and run. With Ausar Thompson, who I believe is like a 5th percentile athlete, maybe even higher. Ivy, who's an insane athlete. Cade, who loves to push the break and find guys. Jalen Duren, who's an insane athlete, runs the floor really well. Their core guys all love to be in transition. They all love to run, and they have the athleticism now on both sides with Ivy and Ausar, with Duren trailing or leading them in front of them, with Cade orchestrating everything. They have it to where that should be what they do. I feel like that's what their personnel is. They should try to force turnovers, play aggressive, and get out in transition as much as possible. Is that something that Monty has done? It sounds like, listening to you in the last segment, that maybe he plays it a little bit more passive. Did you see Monty ever have his team play aggressively defensively like that in the passing lanes, or when it comes to forcing turnovers? Your mic's muted. You're all good.
Yeah, I mean, I think even with the, I was letting you do the FanDuel read and then got carried away. No, I think even with the scheme I was describing, right, it's like they are helping aggressively within the rules, right? So, like, you just look at the stats, and, like, they were top 10 in turnover rate all 4 years in terms of how often they were creating them as a defense, and they were top 12 in transition frequency they were around 10th, let's say, in transition frequency his first 3 seasons here before last season when injuries and everything it's impossible to measure anything. They were like 4 different teams last year. So a lot of those stats I would take with a grain of salt. So like you add that up and I agree, like he's going to play to the personnel, right? Like the first season, Kelly Oubre is not a Monty Williams player. Like if you were to put one in a factory, right? He's struggled with playing team ball no matter where he's gone, Charlotte, Golden State, wherever. But Monty played him because he found out, like, okay, Kelly can create steals. Kelly's a great transition scorer. He's a good cutter. Like, let's try to maximize what he can be as a player. And yeah, he's going to take some bad threes and do whatever. So I think, like, you go back to those moments and he's going to play to his strength. He's going to play young guys and try to put them into position to succeed. So I would expect that the athletic guys on this team, whether that is Asar or Jaden or Jalen, I think all 3 of those guys are going to be able to show what makes them special. And if they can prove it, like I said, I think Monty will give them that leeway to make plays, and that includes on the defensive end. I just think from an aggressiveness standpoint, I would not expect, switching 1 through 5 and Jalen Duren, is suddenly like trying to contain John Morant with 18 seconds left on the clock or something crazy like that. He's not Steve Kerr. He's not going to reimagine everything. But yeah, I think that he will take advantage of what makes his team good. And a lot of what you just said is part of what makes the roster good. So you got to do that.
I'm happy to hear that basically in your explanation, Monty will adjust his scheme to the personnel, not make his personnel just to his scheme. And that was something I feel like was a little bit of an issue, I feel like, at times for the Pistons over the last few years. And I'm hoping that with Monty Williams moving forward, that we see some schemes and see some things on both ends of the floor where it is fitting for the players that matter on the team. Maybe not fitting for like, the 8th, 9th, 10th guy in the rotation, but obviously for a Cade, for an Asar, an Ivy, for Duren, doing what's best in their interest. That I'm really interested to see how he plays them on offense, but even more so defensively, to be honest. But let's move on to Monty as a playoff coach real quick, and we'll wrap up the podcast. Mm-hmm. So all these things about Monty, I've heard he's a great leader. I've heard I've heard overall some really good things about Monty Williams. But the one thing that I've heard from Phoenix fans and some people abroad is that when it comes to the playoffs, he leaves some stuff to be desired. I didn't follow Phoenix enough throughout the playoffs to where I was sitting there trying to analyze Monty as a coach. I was mostly, with the Pistons not being in there, we're usually watching for fun. We're trying to just enjoy our time, So I wasn't watching that intently like that to where I would be analyzing each move he was making, whatever. Do you feel like that the idea that Monty leaves some more to be desired in the playoffs? Do you think that's a little overblown? Do you think he's okay? What's your overall thoughts of him as a playoff coach?
Yeah, I think there's 2 reasons he got fired. I think that there is some stubbornness that I've been, alluding to as we're talking about scheme and personnel. I think that there is a way that he wants to play, and while he is a little bit flexible within that, there is a boundary that he's not necessarily willing to go through, and, he sticks to his guns about certain things. There will be, there were guys where it's like, why is he not getting a chance to play? Why are you not willing to kind of mess with what that lineup could look like, or this change might be able to open up for this player and things like that. And mentality wise and everything else, like we don't have to get into all that. But the other reason I think he got fired, and it kind of goes in conjunction with it a little bit, is not being kind of experimental enough over the course of a season, over the course of multiple seasons in a row, to be prepared for the different types of things that you're going to face. Because we can talk all day about what his philosophies are and what the personnel is and whatever. There's also the element of who are you playing? What do you need to do to win a game? What do you need to do to win a series, right? And there were a lot of games over the 4 years he was here that Suns fans are just slapping themselves in the face like, how are we losing that game again the same exact way? How is that adjustment not being made, right? And look at what Nikola Jokic did to this team in the playoffs, and I think it's a perfect example. Look at Luka Doncic getting whatever switch he wanted over and over, late in the clock of that Dallas series in those, fist fight type of basketball games that Luka makes his team play, right? And the Suns just didn't have answers for that. And I think you could say, okay, make the adjustment, but if you're not using the whole season, you're not using different pockets of the season to experiment and prepare your team to adjust when you need to adjust, then you don't even get the luxury of making that adjustment when the time comes, right? So I think that's where those things are where he ran into a wall here, and I think it was the right move to let him go for the point where this team was with Kevin Durant and Devin Booker and a new owner and all these expectations. You need to win, and you need to know that you have the right guy in place where when the time comes, he's going to make the chess move that he needs to make and deal with the consequences. And it just didn't feel like he was comfortable with the idea of being aggressive, trying something and losing. Like he wanted to go down his way, right? And so that's kind of where I come down, but luckily, like, we never thought in Phoenix we'd be there 4 years after he got hired, and somehow the team got better, and all of a sudden we're watching that all happen. So I don't think it's a problem that should face the Pistons in the immediate future. But yeah, I mean, by the time they're in the postseason or trying to chase a championship, which, you know, you'd hope happens, it's going to be a little bit of a struggle, I think. That's just the reality. He's gotten fired twice now for very similar reasons from New Orleans and Phoenix.
Fair enough. We'll wrap it up there.
We ended on a downer note. You gave me the downer question at the end. I feel like
we have to be honest about things. We can't just be all rainbows and butterflies. We gotta be honest about things. Pistons fans need to know what's coming and the history of everything. So I appreciate you being very honest about it and giving us fair analysis of it. So appreciate you coming on, Brendan, for real. All of you guys want any kind of Phoenix Suns coverage, head over to Brendan's Twitter at BrendanClean14, or you can obviously follow him on Locked On Suns on YouTube, whatever podcast platform you are listening to this podcast on. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button at the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe. Until next time, peace out.